In this lesson, we'll talk about the basic principles of moving a 3D object around inside of Cinema 4D's workspace. Okay, so for this lesson, I'm just going to start with a blank scene here. Now, let's start by just dropping in a primitive object. So let's go up to our little blue cube icon up here, and let's drop in just a simple pyramid. Okay, so here's our pyramid object. Now you'll notice whenever we drop this in, this object is selected. We can see that it's selected by this little orange halo around it. Now with this object selected, we can see these three little arrows. Now these correspond to our three axes of movement in 3D space. So we have our y-axis. This is highlighted in green. The y-axis is going to be our up and down movement. We have the x-axis, which is highlighted in red. This is going to be our side-to-side or our left-to-right movement. And then we have our z-axis. And our z-axis is usually going to be our front-to-back direction of movement. Now, we can move any of these three axes by just simply grabbing that little arrow and picking it up and moving the object along that axis. Okay, pretty straightforward. We can also move along two axes at the same time. So let's say I wanted to take this pyramid and move it sort of back in this direction. So I could grab it from this x-axis, move it back, and grab it from the z-axis and move it back in this direction. So that's sort of a two-click solution. What I could also do is, just move this a little bit closer so it's a little bit easier for you to see. We could actually grab this little area right between the two arrows. So if I grab this little area right between the z and the x-axis, what I can now do is move in both of those axes simultaneously. So now I can slide this pyramid right along the ground as far back or as far forward as I want. Now with this move tool active, which is going to be this little four-sided arrow. This is what I'm currently using to grab this object and move it around. Now with this move tool active, if I click anywhere outside of this object and click and drag, you can see it's actually moving in all three axes at the same time. Okay, now next to my move tool, I have my scale tool. So when I turn this on, you can see my little manipulator here changes from three arrows to instead these three little colored boxes. Again, same X, Y, and Z axes. Now, what I'm demonstrating on is going to be a little bit different because you can see no matter which of these axes I grab, it's always scaling my object uniformly. And that's really because this is a primitive object inside of Cinema 4D. So primitive objects work a little bit differently, and Justin will sort of explain that in a little bit more detail whenever you get into the modeling section. But for now, this really isn't a problem. We don't necessarily have to use these scale manipulators for our primitive objects. If you look very, very closely, we have sort of these little orange lines that are inside of our object. Now these lines actually contain a little manipulator, and it's really, really difficult to see because the manipulator is the same color as this outline, but it is definitely there. If you look very closely as I move my mouse to sort of where these little lines connect, you can see there's this little bitty white point. So if I grab that little white point, I can actually resize some of the different aspects of this primitive object. Okay, so we do have that freedom. So next to our scale tool, we also have rotate. You can see when I switch to my rotate tool, now we have these three little rings, again, X, Y, and Z axes. So I can come in and freely click and drag and move my object around. Now once again, if I take my cursor with my rotate tool active and click anywhere outside of this area, you can see that this will essentially rotate my object around the screen space. Now in addition to being able to work with my objects, scale, position, and rotate, from this top toolbar we can also control these attributes from this area down here. Now this is called the coordinate manager. So here we have position X, Y, and Z. We have size X, Y, and Z. And then we have rotation. Now rotation, you'll notice, doesn't have X, Y, and Z. Instead it uses this HPB. Now this is going to stand for heading, pitch, and bank. So you'll notice as I start to, let's say, move this object around, as I rotate it, you can see that this changes down to my coordinate manager. As I switch to my move tool and move this object around, again, if you look down at my coordinate manager, you can see that the position is changing. If I wanted to, we could actually come in and manually type values in here. So if I wanted this to be zeroed back out, I could just type 0, 0, and 0, and there we go. Now same with rotation. If I wanted this to be 0, 0, and 0, you can see now my object no longer has any rotation that's been applied to it. Now we could actually move our objects directly from within this coordinate manager. So if I wanted to, let's say, move my object up a certain height, I could come in and dial this up. So let's say I wanted to move this up 122 centimeters. And notice as I grab this little spinner and move it up and down, nothing really happens. And really that's sort of what we have to keep in mind inside of Cinema 4D. We won't see any of these changes until we come over here and hit apply. And now you can see those changes have been applied, and now we have our object that is moving. What we could also do is, once we click and drag, just press the enter key on your keyboard. That will force that to accept those changes as well. Okay, now one last thing that I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson is next to my move, scale, and rotate tool, we have these X, Y, and Z axis indicators, and this fourth button that's a part of this set of tools. So let's explore what we have. If we go back to our move tool, and again, if we click and drag, we are moving freely in all three axes. Now let's just very quickly, before we start to get too deep into this, let me first talk about what we have with this button right over here. Now this will switch us between a world and an object-based coordinate system. So for example, right now, we have this little cube with an arrow next to it. This means that we are in an object coordinate. And you can see, if I take my little pyramid here, rotate it, and then jump back to my move tool, you can see that the axes stay oriented to my object. So my y-axis is sort of pointing off in this direction. It's sort of looking at this object's orientation and this object's local y-axis. Now, if I click on this button, we can set this to a world coordinate system. And now you can see, regardless of how my object is oriented, the X, Y, and Z axis indicators always stay oriented to the world axis. So sometimes this can be useful if we maybe temporarily want to move an object along its local y-axis at a certain point, and then we decide we want to now move it down along the world y-axis. We have full control over that. Now, this option, or this switch between the world and the object coordinate system, also ties in with these three options. So back to what I was sort of talking about, with these three options all enabled, if I click and drag anywhere outside of my manipulators, you can see it's moving freely in all three axes. But let's say maybe I just wanted it to move along the y-axis. So what I could do is lock all these axes, leaving the y-axis unlocked. And now, again, if I click and drag anywhere outside the manipulators, you can see it's only going to move it along the y-axis. If I, let's say, maybe only wanted it to move along the Z and X axes, I could turn both of those on, click and drag. You can see now it's moving it along the X and the Z axes, but it's leaving the Y axis alone. So that's sort of what these little locks up here do. These have to do with what sort of behavior you'll get whenever you click outside the manipulators. Now again, these three options also tie into the coordinate system. So with the y-axis checked and this set to the object coordinates, as I click and drag, it's moving it along this object's local y-axis. If I switch this back to world mode, click and drag, now it's moving it along the world y-axis. And we can very quickly toggle back and forth between this world coordinate and an object coordinate by quickly tapping the W key on our keyboard. So W, you can see as I type that or tap that very quickly, it will toggle us back and forth. Right, and the keyboard shortcuts to move back and forth between move, scale, and rotate. We have our E key, so E is going to be move. We have T, which is going to be our scale, and then R, which is rotate. Okay, so that's a look at the basic workflows of moving objects around inside of Cinema 4D's viewport.